Today we journey into the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, America's most sacred and storied final resting place for its heroes. From the gentle slopes that cradle tales of valor to the endless rows of white headstones whispering stories of sacrifice, Arlington tells the story of a nation. We are honored to be joined by Allison Finkelstein, senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery. Enjoy the episode. So, Allison, welcome to American History Gazette.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Now, this is a very special episode. I'm very excited because last September, I actually visited DC, and Arlington was my favorite place. It was so profound. I was absolutely blown away by the scale and the beauty and the reverence of it all. I mean, it was just surreal, like being there in person. But this isn't just a cemetery. It's a place to honor and remember all the brave men and women who have served our country and given their lives for our freedom. But this land dates back over 200 years. So, who first owned it and started building on it, and how's it actually connected to George Washington?
Thank you. That is a great place to start. We always like to start the history of the property that later became Arlington National Cemetery by really reminding our audiences that this land at first was inhabited by indigenous people from the Powhatan Confederation. And it's been rather difficult to do a lot of archaeological work on the property because it's been so turned over throughout the years. So we don't have a lot of detail on those people, but there was some type of habitation in the vicinity of what became the cemetery. The real story begins, for our purposes today, of the history of the cemetery with the land under the ownership of George Washington Parke Custis. George Washington Parke Custis was the stepson of our nation's first president, George Washington. So his grandmother was Martha Washington, and he was really raised by George Washington and Martha Washington. He was very close to his step-grandfather, George Washington. And when George Washington Parke Custis took the land that became Arlington National Cemetery, he used the labor of enslaved people that he owned to build his Arlington estate. And when he had this house constructed, he envisioned it not just as his family home, but as a living memorial to President George Washington, as a place that would really commemorate the nation's first president. And when you go to Arlington House today, you can really get a sense of that. It's a very grand house. It's large, it's neoclassical, and it's situated on a high hilltop overlooking Washington, D.C. And George Washington Parke Custis specifically put the house there for two reasons. So that the house, this memorial to George Washington, could be seen throughout the new nation's capital, and second, so that he and his family could see out over the new nation's capital. It was really a power play. So that beautiful house there is today owned by the National Park Service. It's actually not owned or operated by the U.S. Army, who owns and operates the cemetery. We like to think of it as a little island of Park Service property within Arlington National Cemetery. So I encourage all of your listeners to go to the National Park Service's website, read their materials, and learn about that story, because it's a really special place where just a metro ride away from downtown Washington, D.C., you can learn about antebellum life in Virginia. You can see the two remaining enslaved quarters. You can learn about what it was like to be enslaved at the Arlington plantation and what that property was like in the years before the Civil War.
Wow, that's fascinating. It truly is a very beautiful house, especially up on that hill. It really does just completely overlook everything on sort of that vantage point. But something interesting that I've learned recently was actually Confederate General Robert E. Lee found himself into the Washington family tree, per se, and eventually came to live at that house, although he never actually owned it. So can you just explain how the house is connected to Robert E. Lee?
Yes, so Robert E. Lee married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, who was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, the person who created the Arlington plantation. They were married inside the home, and when her father died, Mary Lee, at that point, inherited the estate. So Robert E. Lee never owned the estate. It was always the property of his wife. And they raised their family there. Robert E. Lee was in charge of the enslaved population there, and there's been a lot of research done on his interaction with the enslaved people. Some of it is really not a happy story. And that is a part of the history that has to be addressed when we think about Arlington National Cemetery. Even though the U.S. Army does not own that little circle, that island of Park Service property, it is inextricably linked to the history of the cemetery. So it's really important that we acknowledge the enslaved people who labored on the estate, that we acknowledged those who enslaved them, and that we recognize that at its heart, at its very origins, Arlington National Cemetery is also a site of enslavement. And I say that because of the reason that the U.S. Army ended up taking over the property. And this takes us now to the spring of 1861. And if you guys remember, we talked about, Jake and I, that magnificent view overlooking Washington, D.C. from the house. That is a strategically important hilltop. Civil War era artillery could range from the top of that hill to every federal government building in Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee, as an Army officer, knew that no matter which side he chose during the Civil War, the U.S. Army would have to occupy that property. And indeed, that is what happened. After Robert E. Lee took up arms against his nation, left the U.S. Army, and went to fight against his country with the Confederacy, the U.S. Army occupied the Arlington plantation. And they had to do this. They were creating a ring of forts that encircled Washington, D.C., and many of those are actually still in existence today, run by the National Park Service. They're really interesting to go and visit. 3 major fortifications were built on the Arlington property, and one of those remains today. It's what we now call Fort Myer. But what's important for our story is that the Army occupied this land, and until 1863, the main purpose of it was to protect Washington, D.C. And then in 1863, another purpose was added.
Yeah, going back earlier to what you said, I think it's very important to remember and acknowledge that this originally was a slave plantation, and although a darker stain on American history, obviously, it's very important to remember and acknowledge and be respectful of that, because you have to study the past so you can understand the present and contextualize the future, right? But it does play a big role in the Civil War. Obviously, Robert E. Lee can't stay there for too long if he's going to go fight with the Confederacy, because obviously, like you said, the government was going to take this. So the U.S. government does take over this land because it is very strategically important. Does it ever see any action?
No, there were no skirmishes on the Arlington property, and we have to remember that the Northern Virginia area was very heavily fortified with this ring of fortifications. But you can see incredible photos, actually, of these fortifications, historic photos of them, so you can get a sense of the type of strategic defense that was happening in the Arlington area.
So when did the U.S. government officially acquire the land as, federal property?
So that is a rather complicated story that I am going to give you the Cliff Notes version of today so that we don't get into a lot of legal jargon. During the Civil War, the Army seized the property, and Mary Lee was told that she had to pay taxes on the property in person. Now, obviously, she couldn't go in person to pay them. She sent a family member. Those taxes were not accepted because it was not the owner herself, so that helped justify the U.S. Army's seizure of the property. Fast forward to after the Civil War, there was actually a court case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court with Mary and Robert E. Lee's son, who took this issue to the legal system and eventually won the case that the property had been seized and that he should have compensation. But what ended up happening was he actually sold the property back to the government. So the U.S. government purchased the property back from him.
Definitely some very complicated legal gymnastics here in this story, but nevertheless, the U.S. government comes to officially acquire this land as federal property. And going back to the Arlington House briefly, you mentioned that it's under the National Park Service now. So, what is the significance of the house now? And is that still the original house that was built on the property?
Yes, so that house is the original house. It's obviously undergone many changes throughout the years, and the National Park Service just did a recent renovation to really preserve it for posterity. You can go, you can tour the house, you can see the enslaved quarters. There's also a small museum that the National Park Service runs there. So the significance of the house today, the National Park Service is really interpreting it as a site of enslavement, as a place where critical moments of the Civil War took place. And I encourage your listeners and visitors to go check out their exhibits, look at their website, and really get a sense of the nuanced, multi-layered history that is being told at that property.
Yeah, when I visited Arlington, I didn't get to go up and check out the house up close, but that is definitely something I plan on doing in the future. But the U.S. government controls the property now, and I'm sure dealing with all of the military casualties from the Civil War was probably a big issue. So is that how it became a national burial ground for military personnel, was because of the Civil War?
It's because of the Civil War, but the story of the cemetery actually has another chapter that started in 1863 before the first military burials took place. And I would be remiss if I did not pause and talk about that because it's a very important chapter of the cemetery's history. We mentioned before how starting in the spring of 1861, the U.S. Army built a series of 3 fortifications on this property. Then in 1863, they also established a freedmen's village on the property. At this point in the Civil War, formerly enslaved people were actually seizing their own freedom. They were escaping to U.S. lines to try and start a new life for themselves and gain freedom. And many of these formerly enslaved people, who were known at the time as freed people or freed men and freed women, came to the Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia area. And the region essentially had a refugee problem. These people were refugees of war. They had no money, they had no property, they had no means of supporting themselves. So the government established what were basically refugee camps. And they placed one of these on the Arlington property, and it was called Freedmen's Village. And it was intended to be a model community to really help ease the transition into freedom for these newly freed people. And actually last month, for Black History Month, we did a whole webinar about the Freedmen's Village with the National Archives and a descendant of the enslaved at Arlington. So I encourage people to go check it out. You can learn a lot more of the detailed history in that webinar. But that all happened before the first military graves were placed here at Arlington. Those first military graves were not added until 1864. The first grave was in May of 1864. It was the grave of William Christman, who was from Pennsylvania and died of an illness in a Washington, D.C. hospital. And of course, this begs the question now of, well, why was the Army choosing to bury the war dead at Arlington? And that really is the origin story of the burial part of the cemetery. And the answer has to do with what was happening during the Civil War at that time. By 1864, the casualty and fatality rate of the Civil War was astonishingly high. Men were dying in combat, they were dying of disease. Many of them were dying of disease and dying from their wounds in Washington, D.C. area hospitals. And without intending to be too morbid, the city was really overrun with the dead and the dying, and this is a major sanitary issue at the time. So the government had to find more places to bury these war dead. They were burying some of them in cemeteries like Alexandria National Cemetery, but they were running out of room. And they had this massive property across the river in Arlington, so in May of 1864, they started using it as a military burial ground. And by June of 1864, it was officially declared a national cemetery. So the Civil War was the first time that the U.S. government actually took the responsibility of caring for the war dead, which is pretty incredible when you think about it today. This was the first time. And everything was in its very early stages of development, very rough and tumble around the edges. So by 1864, yes, there were other national cemeteries, but the system was still very much in its infancy. Arlington National Cemetery was not the first one. It was among those established in 1864 and 1865. And we really look at it as one among a larger network of Civil War era cemeteries. And I'm sure you've been to some of those. Gettysburg National Cemetery, Antietam National Cemetery, many of the Civil War cemeteries that are adjacent to or near Civil War battlefields today. And I also want to point out for your listeners that it's 2024. So for those of you who are good at math, this year is the 160th anniversary of Arlington National Cemetery's establishment. And I can talk later in this podcast about some of the special events we're doing to recognize that in the spring.
Wow, that is incredible. That's fascinating. Well, congratulations on 160 years. But thank you for sharing that very important piece of history about the Freedmen's Village. That's definitely something we don't want to gloss over. But the Civil War was the government's first orchestrated, organized effort to deal with the Civil War casualties on a larger scale, because this was America's bloodiest conflict. There was a lot of casualties, and this was modern medicine. It was still very rudimentary, so a lot of people were dying of disease, like you mentioned. But I'd like to pivot now to arguably the focal point of Arlington National Cemetery, and that is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It is a very reverent, very chilling place to visit, in my opinion. So what is the significance of this monument, and when and why was it built?
Well, thank you for that question. The tomb is a really sacred place at Arlington National Cemetery, and our history office has really focused very deeply on interpreting its history, especially since 2021, when we commemorated the centennial of the tomb. We were really able to dive into its history, and you can find a lot of those resources on our website, arlingtoncemetery.mil/tomb100. We have a whole set of resources there, including a guidebook that you can look at for free, a lecture series about the tomb, all sorts of different webinars and events. So I could talk about the tomb for hours.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode just about the tomb.
I just want to give you a warning. I want to give you a warning and give your listeners a warning. I'm actually working on finishing a book manuscript about the origins and history of the tomb. So I will try my best to give you the Cliff Notes version of its history and then talk some about the significance. So in the wake of the First World War, Great Britain and France in 1920 decided to create a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. In France, it was eventually placed under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and in Great Britain, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior was placed inside Westminster Abbey. And the British and French did this because they suffered incredible amounts of fatalities, but particularly unidentifiable fatalities in the hundreds of thousands or more. So the United States was watching. They were reading about this in the newspapers, and a World War I veteran who was serving as a newly elected congressman from New York, Hamilton Fish, who had served with the 369th Infantry, a segregated unit. He was a white officer leading some members of that unit, popularly known as the Harlem Hellfighters. He put forth legislation in Congress to create an American Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And that legislation passed on March 4th, 1921. And after a long series of debates and disagreements in Congress, the decision was eventually made to locate it at Arlington National Cemetery at the Memorial Amphitheater, which had opened just 1 year before in 1920. What happened next was over in France, the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps was responsible for disinterring the remains of 4 unidentifiable American service members from 4 of the American military cemeteries in France. Those 4 sets of unidentifiable remains were taken to the town of Chalon-sur-Marne, France, which is now called Chalon in Champagne. And there, in the city hall, a ceremony was held. A decorated U.S. World War I veteran, Sergeant Edward Younger, who is actually buried at Arlington, circled around those caskets and chose one of the 4 to be selected as the unknown soldier buried at the new tomb being created in Arlington. Amidst a series of ceremonies from the French, the unknown soldier was eventually taken to the port of Le Havre, where he was taken aboard the USS Olympia, a very famous ship in U.S. naval history, and went on a tumultuous journey across the Atlantic, arriving here in Washington, D.C., ahead of a November 11th burial. I could go into all sorts of details about what that burial entailed, but for the sake of time today, I'm just going to share that there was a procession from the U.S. Capitol all the way across the city of Washington, across the Potomac River to Arlington National Cemetery, where after a service in Memorial Amphitheater, the unknown soldier was buried in the tomb, which at that point was not completely finished. It did not reach its final stage of completion to what we see today until 1932. Hundreds of thousands of Americans came out to honor the unknown soldier, and it very quickly became a sacred place of pilgrimage.
Wow, that is such an incredible story. I mean, the procession across DC, I didn't know that part of it. That's incredible and shows you how willing Americans are to honor those who have sacrificed their lives for us. But it gets its inspiration from the British and France, like you mentioned, which is pretty interesting. So it dates back to World War I, and something that's synonymous with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is the changing of the guard ceremony, which is a deeply moving tradition. So can you just explain what this ritual symbolizes and how it was created?
Yes, the changing of the guard ceremony, which thousands and thousands of people see each year, was not something that was part of the original vision for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. At first, the tomb was not guarded, but over a series of changes in the 1920s and the 1930s, eventually the decision was made to place a permanent 24/7 guard at the tomb. Today, this duty is led by the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Regiment, also known as the Old Guard, and soldiers from the Old Guard who go through a very strenuous selection process. Guard the unknown soldier through perfection, through ritual, through stamina, and through a series of choreography, really, that strives for perfection in order to demonstrate that the U.S. military has not forgotten and will never forget those who gave not only their lives but also their identities in defense of the nation. And that, if you talk to many tomb guards, is really the crux of the meaning of that symbolism. The tomb guards will often say, tomb guards never forget. And I don't want to speak for them. They are much more articulate at this. They have a very close emotional relationship with the tomb. But that duty is considered outside of the self and focused entirely on honoring those unknown comrades.
Wow, that is incredible. That is one of the things I witnessed when I was there, and it's just absolutely remarkable, the perfection and the discipline that they do it with. It's like they almost seem like they're not even human. They're so focused and disciplined, and every movement is the exact same, and the ground where they walk on and everything is actually worn down of the exact steps that they all take. And it's mind-blowing that they all have that synchronized discipline and timing and choreography to do this over and over again 24/7, like you mentioned. It's never unguarded, which is just absolutely incredible. But something you mentioned earlier that I'd like to get into is the Memorial Amphitheater, which you mentioned that it was actually built prior to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So why was the Memorial Amphitheater built, and what is its purpose?
I'm so glad you asked about Memorial Amphitheater. It is just a spectacular building that really explains a lot of Arlington National Cemetery's evolution. So, if we can go back in time for a minute to the years just after the Civil War, the nation was really struggling with how to commemorate that conflict. And ad hoc rituals started popping up in the springtime where people would go and decorate the graves of the war dead with flowers. There's been a lot of great history written on some of the early iterations of that tradition. And by 1868, a big change happened. General John Logan, who was a Civil War veteran and then a member of Congress and the leader of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the most powerful and influential U.S. Civil War veterans organization. He declared that in May of 1868, there would be an official Decoration Day observance, and that official observance was held at Arlington National Cemetery. And this ceremony and holiday soon became really popular. So in the 1870s, the U.S. Army actually built a small amphitheater near Arlington House as a venue for Decoration Day. And this amphitheater, which we now call Tanner Amphitheater, and Decoration Day really changed Arlington. This was the turning point for the cemetery. Because before Decoration Day, Arlington was just another one of that network of Civil War cemeteries. There was nothing special or really different about it. In fact, it was really viewed as a place where soldiers whose families couldn't afford to return their remains home were buried. But with the annual National Decoration Day observance, with the Tanner Amphitheater, Arlington rose in prominence, and famous Civil War officers wanted to be buried there. They wanted to be part of the action. So this holiday evolved, it became really popular. Today, we know it as Memorial Day. And by the turn of the century, it was clear that this very small amphitheater was not big enough to really hold the Memorial Day observance. So the decision was made to create Memorial Amphitheater as a grand venue to really elevate the ceremony. It can hold about 5,000 people. It's of a neoclassical Beaux-Arts design made of this beautiful, bright, shining marble. It opened in 1920, and I could talk to you for days, probably, about all of the different symbolism inscribed on that amphitheater. But this amphitheater was meant to be like the Westminster Abbey of the United States, a place that would elevate Arlington and really provide a formal venue for these military cemetery ceremonies.
Wow, that's so special and so profound. So the amphitheater is really what set Arlington above everything else, and really made Arlington that special and revered burial site for military personnel, because you mentioned it was just a network of military cemeteries, but the amphitheater is what made Arlington special. And it is a very beautiful place. It looks very like Greek Roman with giant pillars, and it's very stunning. I would like to learn about all the symbolism of the engravings one day. That would be pretty cool. But something I would like to talk about is the actual headstones. The headstones are one of the most breathtaking part of the cemetery, because they're all these white marble headstones that just go for as far as the eye can see, and they're all uniform and in line, and it's just a stunning sight to see. But how did the marble headstones come about? Was that there to begin with, or was that an addition that was later brought about to be buried with the uniform marble headstones?
Initially, at Civil War era national cemeteries, wooden headboards were used as grave markers. But obviously, that's not a stable or permanent way to mark graves. So eventually, there were all sorts of shifts and experiments, but those stone headstones were selected. and they were selected as the standard government issue headstone. For many decades at Arlington National Cemetery, a service member's family could choose to pay for and provide a private marker for their grave. So, at Arlington, you will often see those rows of exactly similar headstones, but sometimes you'll see interspersed some different headstones that don't look as typical. And that's an indication that you're in an older section and that those families chose to pay for a private marker, and some of them are quite beautiful. They're not allowed anymore. There were a series of changes and rules over the years that now prohibit those. But I want to emphasize to your listeners that those private markers are private from the family. It was not the government showing any preference to one service member over the other. Everyone's entitled to the standard government issue headstone. And the idea was really that everyone would be honored as equally as possible, although throughout the history of the cemetery that was not always possible, because until 1948, Arlington National Cemetery was segregated by both race and rank.
So there are a few standout headstones there, but they were provided privately by the family, which is interesting. But I said earlier that Arlington, with the rows of headstones, goes as far as the eye can see. It's a stunning sight. So fast forwarding to today, how large is Arlington now, and how many people are buried there?
Yes, so Arlington is very big. I don't have the exact acreage, but it is over, I believe, 640 acres. We have over 400,000 people buried here, and I can never give an exact number to that question because on weekdays we have up to 25 funerals a day.
These are over 400,000. These are, from what I understand, soldiers from every war in American history, even the Revolutionary War, even though the cemetery started obviously during the Civil War, but there's actually people born or buried there from the Revolutionary War, which is incredible. So who are like the oldest people that are buried there that are from the Revolutionary War?
Yes, so those Revolutionary War burials are what we call reinterred remains. So once Arlington developed and became this really sacred, famous site, the decision was made to reinter service members from previous conflicts, including the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War. So that's why we have those older burials. I think that I can't give you just the oldest one, but I think one person we have to talk about is Pierre l'Enfant. Pierre l'Enfant, of course, was French, and he joined the fight with the American Revolution. So he helped fight for our nation's liberty. And after the war, he played a really influential role in designing Washington, D.C., designing the new capital. And for many years, his remains were buried in an undignified way, and they were really not given the prominence and the honor that l'Enfant deserved. So his remains were reinterred and buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In fact, right in front of Arlington House, on that hilltop, overlooking the city that his vision helped design.
Wow, that is incredible. I mean, a man like that definitely deserves to be buried with honor, but how fitting to be buried on the hill overlooking the city that he helped design. That's almost poetic, you know? But there's a lot of very notable figures buried here. You have two presidents. Most famously, you have JFK's large grave, which is another very stunning place to go and see at Arlington. But can you just give me some of the most notable figures that are buried there?
Wow, that's a big question. Our team at Arlington likes to say that every grave here is notable to someone. So I don't want to favor one burial over another, but I can certainly provide an overview of some people famous and maybe some people not so well known that your audience might be interested in listening to. We've covered a couple of them already, such as Pierre l'Enfant. Of course, we have President William Howard Taft, President John F. Kennedy. We also have Robert F. Kennedy. We have many justices from the Supreme Court, such as Thurgood Marshall, a famous civil rights warrior. We have Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's buried here because her husband, Martin Ginsburg, was in the U.S. Army. We have General John J. Pershing, who was the leader of the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I, and a really influential figure in the first half of the 20th century. Just so much we could talk about in terms of General John J. Pershing. We have the grave of Audie Murphy, who many believe was the most highly decorated service member during World War II. He played himself in the movie, The Audie Murphy Story, which is definitely a good one to check out. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen that film. We have many, many Medal of Honor recipients, too many for me to go over today. We have combat fatalities from many different conflicts. We have service members from all periods of history, including peacetime. We also have some people who are not as expected to be buried here. We have many women who were leaders in the suffrage movement. For example, we have Anna Kelton Wiley, who was buried here because of her husband's military service. She was a suffrage leader who was actually arrested and jailed for picketing the White House. We have Zitkala Sa, who was a Native American activist and artist, also married to a veteran, who really worked hard for the voting rights of Native Americans and for women's rights. We have many path-breaking female service members who broke barriers, such as Admiral Grace Hopper, who, if anybody out there is listening and interested in computer science, she was a really critical figure in the development of computers. She coined the term having a bug in your computer when she actually found a bug and called it that. We have an entire section of nurses, women who served from the Spanish-American War through today, who fought for equal treatment in the military. We actually have some Civil War nurses that one of my colleagues recently discovered. We have all sorts of firsts. We have all sorts of barrier-breaking people. But what we always like to tell our visitors is that everywhere you look at the cemetery, you can find a story. And sometimes the stories that are most impactful are the stories of people whose names are not as famous.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. I by no means want to downplay the significance of everyone buried there. You're absolutely right. Every single headstone in that cemetery has a special story and a special way that they served our country. And it's incredible that there's people born from all time periods or buried there from all time periods of American history, even during peacetime, which is incredible. But another focal point at Arlington are all of its memorials. It has many memorials commemorating disasters and wars. I know they have the Space Shuttle Challenger, for example. So what is the significance of its memorials, and what are some of the more prominent ones?
I'm so glad you asked that, because Arlington is what we really like to call a cultural landscape, a memorial environment where people who are no longer living are memorialized through their graves, but where aspects of the nation's history are also commemorated through monuments and memorials. There's so many to talk about. I'll just pick a few. I think one of the most fascinating is the mast of the USS Maine Memorial. This is actually the mast of the battleship Maine, taken from where it sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898, which of course was the spark that ignited the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged up the harbor, lifted up the Maine, and the masts were taken. One is at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. The other is here at Arlington National Cemetery, and it functions as a memorial to those who died aboard the USS Maine. And right next to that memorial is a section where many of those men are buried. Some of them, their remains were never identified. It's a really tangible connection to the Spanish-American War. We also have the Argonne Cross Memorial, which is located in a section of the cemetery where many repatriated remains of the World War I dead are buried. And this Argonne Cross was meant to really commemorate the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the nation's largest offensive in World War I, and still our largest offensive to this date. The offensive that really brought World War I to a close, according to many historians. And the idea of sculpting this in the shape of a cross was meant to reflect that famous poem in Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow amidst the crosses, row on row. So there's a connection there to France, to those places where American service members died during World War I. We also have the Nurses Memorial, another beautiful, striking memorial. It's an Art Deco sculpted figure of a nurse looking over her shoulder, past her cape, viewing the graves of her comrades in the nurses section.
Wow, that is beautiful. I can't believe they actually have the masts of the USS Maine. That's incredible. One at Annapolis at the Naval Academy and one at Arlington, which I have been to the Naval Academy, but I don't think I did get to see that, which I wish I did. That's incredible. And the nurse memorial, how poetic to be looking out over her comrades. That's truly beautiful. But Arlington is not only a military burial ground, it's a historical and cultural site like we've been talking about. So how does Arlington balance its role as a solemn resting place for, reverence and respect, while also being a public site for visitors and tourists?
Well, first and foremost, our priority is always making sure that the families who come here to bury their loved ones have a private, sacred, and beautiful service. So our interment operations team does incredible work to ensure that services are spaced out so that every person who's attending a funeral will feel like they're the only funeral happening at that time, even if there are many happening simultaneously. So I really want to give them credit for the hard work they do. I truly don't understand how they do it. So first and foremost, it's really protecting those funeral services, making sure that every person here is buried with dignity and with honor. And then we have our office, the Arlington National Cemetery History Office. And we have a couple major programs that help us ensure that we are also functioning as a historic site, as a museum site. So we have two different museum spaces at the cemetery. We have a museum exhibit in the Welcome Center, and then we also have a museum exhibit in the display room of Memorial Amphitheater just up the steps above the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And those exhibits are really meant to orient people, share our history, and provide an inside look at the sites they're seeing. We also have an interpretation program, and this is our way of really making sure we're clearly articulating the thematic stories we're telling at the cemetery. So we think very hard about how we're sharing this history. We do the research, but we also think about what's the best way to tell this story. Sometimes it's through podcasts like this, so thank you. Sometimes it's through webinars. Sometimes it's through walking tours that our office leads. And sometimes it's through other programs like social media. I encourage all of you to follow us on social media at Arlington, NATL, because what we're really trying to do there is provide small little exhibits. You can think of them in each post. The posts that come from the history office are meant to interpret the stories and the legacies of the cemetery. So no matter where you are, you can check out our social media and feel like you're seeing a small piece of Arlington's history. We also have an education program. You can find that on our website at education.arlingtoncemetery.mil. And this is a program that's aimed at students of all ages and lifelong learners, which is who you and I would be. So yes, any adult who wants to learn but is maybe not in school, you're considered a lifelong learner. But we also have materials for elementary, middle, and high school. And these are divided up thematically so that people can pick and choose based on the topics that interest them. We have World War II, We have military technology, explorers of earth, air, and space. We have African American history, the Spanish American War. The list goes on. I believe we have over a dozen up right now. But those provide lesson plans, primary sources, activity sheets, and walking tours. And the walking tours for your audience, I think, Jake, are really important because if you're coming to the cemetery, you can download those walking tours and you basically have one of the cemetery's historians in your pocket, except, you can press pause if you've had enough. You can listen by reading, you can get the directions, look at the maps, enjoy the images, and have everything you need right there at your fingertips, on your phone, your tablet, printing it out to guide yourself on a really in-depth exploration of the cemetery. And if you can't get here, a lot of people like using those at home as well.
It seems like you guys are doing a phenomenal job at balancing the two. I love how you have an entire education program because obviously in our profession, like you said, we're lifelong learners, and I believe especially the importance of learning history is extremely important. And the fact that you guys are educating people, educating adults, educating the youth is just absolutely amazing. So kudos to you guys. But you did mention earlier about the 160th anniversary, and you guys have some plans for that. So would you like to explain?
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with your audience. So it's the 160th anniversary of the cemetery. We've already done a few programs, the Freedman's Village webinar that I mentioned, but we're really kicking things into high gear in the spring. So in May, we're going to have several programs. I believe it's on May 13th. We're going to be doing some talks in section 27 of the cemetery, which is actually the first section where military burials happened. And then the weekend of Memorial Day, we have a really important annual event that happens and is happening again during this 160th year. It's called Flowers of Remembrance Day. It is on the Sunday just before Memorial Day. This is a really incredible opportunity where only once a year the public is invited to come and lay a flower at the tomb of the unknown soldier. You can actually walk onto the plaza, which I've been able to do during these events, and it has brought me to tears every time. So we provide the flowers. All you have to do is come over to the cemetery, get in the line, place your flower, and really take in that moment of being able to honor our service members in this tradition that dates back to Decoration Day. And then during that day, our office in the morning is going to be leaving a talk, a lecture about the history of Decoration Day and Memorial Day, and then a walking tour focused on the history of Memorial Day. So we have those events planned for you. We also have some special video products coming out about the 160th, so watch our social media, stay tuned for those. And then in June, we will be doing a couple of special programs. We'll be doing a webinar with the Holocaust Museum. Stay tuned for the date about liberators and survivors buried at the cemetery. And then we will be doing a program. I believe, let me check the date for you so I don't get it wrong. I believe it is June 15th, which was the date that Arlington National Cemetery was officially established as a national cemetery. We'll be doing a special tour with our horticulture team talking about that major anniversary. So stay tuned. Everything will be on our website, on our social media, and even if you can't come in person, we'll have video products as well.
That's so amazing. Everything you just mentioned will be linked in the description, by the way, but that's so beautiful that you guys allow the public to come and lay flowers at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's something that happens every year?
It happens every year now. It's a rather new tradition. It actually started in November 2021 with the Tomb Centennial, and it was so popular that the decision was made to try and bring it back each Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, that's amazing. I definitely plan on coming and doing that someday. But that wraps up our conversation, Allison. I want to thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for taking us on a journey through the history of Arlington and all of its importance and reverence and significance to us today. So, Allison, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
And everything you mentioned will be linked in the description. So, all of the social medias and the important links will be linked in the description. So, again, Allison, thank you.